Always remember this week 1 is the loneliest number. A single performance in the NFL can be extremely encouraging or discouraging, but it is not the end-all, be-all. We can't generate full season projections based on one game without expecting a significant margin of error, a margin so big that it almost becomes meaningless. Well, almost meaningless. It's important to have a certain amount of skepticism on any narrative built after most of the games have been played in the NFL's first week, so I've borrowed some injury report language to ascertain the believability of 10 of these narratives from Sunday. The Cardinals are bad, and Carson Palmer is finished. Palmer went just 27 of 48 with 1 touchdown and 3 interceptions, with just 5.6 yards per attempt, in a 3,523 loss to the Lions in Detroit. On the bright side for Arizona, they were doing enough right to be leading 179 with under 5 minutes remaining in the third quarter. The bad news is they still ended up losing by 12 points. Detroit had one of the worst defenses in the NFL last year and didn't make any notable changes, so the Cards' offense does look like it could be pretty bad. Palmer was showing signs of aging last season, and so far it appears that might not be a mirage. If Palmer isn't near the top of his game, then yes, it appears that Arizona could be bad, but both he and the defense have earned another month to prove what they can still do. I can't figure out who Carson Palmer was throwing to. Matt Miller at Draft Scout September 10, 2017. This narrative is questionable. Carson Wentz is ready for the next tier after a rough second half last year. Expectations for Wentz ranged all over the place, and some probably argued he was the worst quarterback in the NFC. He had 307 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception in Philly's 2017 win over Washington, and he certainly played much better than Kirk Cousins, who had 3 turnovers. With the Eagles clearly having one of the best defensive lines in the league, Philly may only be a decent Wentz season away from winning the NFC East. This narrative is probable. The Falcons have a Super Bowl hangover and are overrated. Atlanta maybe 10, but in order to beat a Bears team that went 313 last season, it boiled down to stopping Mike Glennon from a one-stand goal at the 5-yard line in the final minute. That's gotta be a little disconcerting for Falcons fans, but I wouldn't fret too much. Chicago was at home and their defense, while bad, wasn't awful last season and maybe improved. The Falcons should still be considered the favorite in the NFC South, and perhaps the NFC in general. This narrative is doubtful. The Texans can make the playoffs with these quarterbacks, maybe after getting sacked 10 times in Houston's 297 loss to Jacksonville at home. It's the quarterbacks who should be complaining. Tom Savage was pulled from the game after a 7 of 13 start with 62 yards. A common Bill O'Brien move to not stick with his named starting QB for more than 2 quarters while getting sacked 6 times. Deshaun Watson came in and was sacked 4 more times while throwing for fewer yards per attempt than Savage had. The Jaguars have sole possession of first place for a week at least, but let's gently tap the brakes. A combo of J.J. Watt, Jadeveon Clowney, Benardrick McKinney and Whitney Mercilus is still good enough to carry a bad QB to a division title. Jacksonville kept Blake Bortles off the ground all day, but they also would have to carry a terrible QB to the playoffs. The South is still very much up for grabs. A 3-second summary of Tom Savage. pic.twitter.com /admire troll Melissa Jacobs at the Football Girl September 10, 2017. This narrative is questionable. The Bengals need to bench Andy Dalton in favor of A.J. McCarron. As short-sighted as benching Dalton sounds, it's not like there is no basis for it. After throwing 4 interceptions on Sunday in a 200 loss to the Ravens, Dalton now has 10 touchdowns and 10 picks over his past 10 games. Cincinnati's record in those games is 361. There was also a report last month that the Bengals turned down an offer of a second-round pick for McCarron, and has held on tightly to him since his intriguing 3 starts in 2015. There has to be a reason for that, and Dalton has some obvious hindrances to his game that could force Marvin Lewis' hand at some point if the season seems lost anyway. However, that time is not now. This narrative is doubtful. Something must be wrong with Le'Veon Bell after Bell waited until last week to sign his franchise tender and report there was a possibility he'd be rusty. He responded with just 32 yards on 10 carries and 3 catches for 15 yards. In 5 career games against the Browns, Bell had never rushed for fewer than 80 yards, and last season he had 201 total yards against Cleveland. But there's also a chance that the Browns' defense is much better, even without Myles Garrett. It was good enough to keep them in the game despite losing 2,118, and this is likely just a slow week for Bell as he works his way toward returning to form as the best back in the NFL. This narrative is doubtful. The Colts are the worst team in the league without Andrew Luck. Indy lost 469 to the Rams, a team that hadn't scored 40 points since 2014. Hell, last year there were 9 games when they failed to score more than 10. The Colts are the worst team in the NFL, and it's possible they don't bring Luck back into a mess like this. Jacoby Brissett in 8 days is better in the Colts system than Scott Tolzien is after 2 years. Ben Volen at Ben Volen, September 10, 2017. This narrative is probable. Kyle Shanahan won't do anything to improve the Niners' offense this season, though the 49ers hired Shanahan away from the Falcons after a record-breaking season, added Pierre Garçon, have a new face at every single wide receiver position, and signed Brian Hoyer. They scored just a field goal against the Panthers and averaged 4 yards per play. The Niners were 31st in total yards last season, and that ranking seems like it could be repeated. Not much will change until the true franchise quarterback is found. This narrative is probable. The Seahawks aren't a real Super Bowl contender with that offensive line despite the addition of Luke Joeckel and proposed improvement at every O-line position over last season's debacle. Russell Wilson was under pressure for 44% of his dropbacks in Seattle's 179 loss on Sunday to the Packers. There also was not a ton of room to run, and it was obvious to everyone that the Seahawks had protection problems once again. That being said, Green Bay's defensive line is underrated. Mike Daniels is perhaps an elite nose tackle just now starting to get the credit he deserves in their WASNTA. Harder place for the Seahawks to open their season than at Lambeau Field. Yes, Seattle's line will still struggle, but it has overcome that issue to contend in the playoffs for each of the past 5 seasons. Seahawks offensive line looking good this year. Pic.twitter.com Kijiapig NFL memes at NFL_memes September 11, 2017. This narrative is doubtful. The Cowboys finally have a great defense to match their great offense. We could safely assume that Dallas was going to have a top 5 offense again once it became apparent that Ezekiel Elliott was going to be rejoining Dak Prescott, Dez Bryant and the offensive line, but what could we expect of a defense that was not only average but lost Barry Church, Brandon Carr, Morris Claiborne and Terrell McClain? The answer on Sunday night was them completely shutting down the Giants and only allowing 3 points. Eli Manning was sacked 3 times and picked off once, and the Giants were helpless without Odell Beckham Jr. And that's the key. It's New York already had a mediocre offense that ranked 22nd in DVOA last year, but on Sunday was without their best player, and the talent gap between Beckham and the next guy for the Giants is massive. You don't need to be OBJ to catch the fact that the Cowboys dominated an offense that will probably get dominated a lot this year. Dallas D could be much improved, but this was not a true test. Wait until Week 5 against Aaron Rodgers and the Packers. This narrative is questionable.